Welcome to Western Sydney University's Institute for Culture and Societies Conference on Terrestrial Politics in Uncertain Times, and thank you to our host partner in this event, the Powerhouse Museum. Our focus in this keynote panel is the work of Bruno Latour, specifically his intellectual legacies and trajectories and how they open up thinking about the challenges of the current terrestrial politics we face. And I'd like to begin by welcoming our speakers, Sophie Chow, Stephen Muki, and in absentia, Dipesh Chakrabarty. But also I'd like to thank you all very much for coming. Before we get underway, I just need to signal that this event is being recorded for potential release on the web and socials, and there will be photography. Afterwards, we're going to have a reception to kick off the major conference tomorrow at the Old Clare Hotel near the corner of Harris Street and Broadway, to which you are all very warmly invited. And we'd very much like to continue the conversation with you there. And we'll put a map up at the end. It's just up Harris Street near Broadway. Now, we're meeting today on Gadigal land that always was and always will be Aboriginal. The shameful rejection of this fact diminishes all settler colonials, but it doesn't diminish the power and the generosity of the Uluru Statement and the ongoing need now, more than ever, for truth-telling and reckoning. And to welcome us to country, I'd like to hand over to Yvonne Maldhan. Yvonne is the first Aboriginal councillor elected to the City of Sydney and was the first Aboriginal candidate for Lord Mayor in the 2021 New South Wales local government elections. She's also served as the elected chair of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council. In 2019, she was awarded the New South Wales Volunteer of the Year for the South Sydney region. In 2022, she was appointed a member of the Order of Australia for her work with Indigenous communities of New South Wales, work that has ranged across health, housing affordability, access, childcare, disability services, domestic violence, Aboriginal heritage and more. Yvonne is also a novelist with her first book, 67 Days, published last year. Thank you, Yvonne.
It's very nerve-wracking when people read out what I've done, because I cringe at times because you don't realise that you actually do contribute in so many different ways, and it's actually an extreme honour of mine. Ladies and gentlemen, sisters and brothers, gender neutral and gender fluid. I've grown physically on this land, but in my blood and always in spirit, I am Wiradjuri. My name is Yvonne Maldhan and I am a sovereign woman. I come from Cowra, here in New South Wales, from the waters of the Clare, which later became known as the Lachlan, and of the Murrumbidgee rivers. I am an authorised representative of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, who are the culture authority under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act for the land we're on. I would like to pay my respects to all elders past and present, to all First Nations, to you and the ancestors of the lands that you've travelled from. A welcome to country is an age-old tradition. It is more than just words. It's not just something you tick off on. It is a spiritual process by honouring the ancestors' footsteps we are all walking in, continuing the practice of the many generations before us to the many generations to come. The boundaries of our traditional owners are written into the earth's natural landscapes. The boundaries of the Ngurra are the Hawkes River in the north, the Nepean in the west, and the Georges River in the south. On behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, the elders and the members, I welcome everyone to the land of the Gadigal. I acknowledge the Gadigal people, whose spirits and ancestors will always remain with this land, our Mother Earth. Across this beautiful continent, there are hundreds of nations, tribes and clans existing here for over 65,000 years. This country's First Nations people are the oldest living culture of the world. And as we're joined here today, let us all remember and acknowledge the many warriors that created pathways for all of us, the ones recognised, and the ones we've never heard of. My people have always listened and learnt from each other, the environment, animals, elements, and our ancestors. We don't live in isolation of body, culture, spirit, land and water, because we are one. We need to reflect upon the footprints and also the footsteps we are making to know where we're heading. Shaping a society and hopefully one day a country we can be proud of. All of us together can bring about positive changes to multiple generations, starting a healing to the past generations by declaring what should not have taken place. To the present day generations, giving us hope in creating a future for the next generations, for everyone in this country. We are in this together, and we can achieve positive change each and every day, bringing my people, your people, and all our people together. As you consider and listen to the views being presented today, reducing the impact on our Mother Earth, and also on each other, looking after self, each other, and our Mother Earth is that constant link, that constant cycle that we need to balance and we need to honour. Remember to reflect about my people's stories and our connection to land that were forever changed when we were erased from the view. We lived in unison with this country for thousands of generations, learned from our ancient practices because we are still here. Think about the difference you can make today and what did not take place on October 14, which could have been a milestone for our future. But now we need to work together so we can hopefully one day walk together in a unified country. It's going to take our work and our commitment to be able to do that truth-telling, to be honest with what we can do and what we must do. But we all need to make sure we are walking together and working together in a positive direction for each and every one of us. Not negating it out, but negating it in. So let us all draw upon my people's spirits as we continue on our journey. May my people's spirits walk with you and guide you as we strive forward for us all. Again, on behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, welcome to Gadigal land. No matter what the 60% believe, this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. Okay, our focus this afternoon is Bruno Latour, the difficult to classify French intellectual who died in October last year. Latour described himself as a mixture between philosopher and anthropologist. Others have tried to locate him in science studies, science and technology studies, sociology and empirical philosophy. Then there are those who've critiqued or derided him as a relativist, an empiricist, a radical constructivist, Bourdieu's assessment, a closet theologian, or as resolutely apolitical. Whatever the classification, it's his thinking and his generative force as a hugely creative, productive and engaged intellectual that we want to focus on today. And we come to this conversation hoping to do justice to the legacy and impact of Latour's work. This doesn't mean that we don't have issues with it, that on occasions it hasn't frustrated or challenged or irritated us with some persistent blind spots, but it does mean that we begin from a position of respect and gratitude for the gift and expansive conceptual and political provocations of his thinking. In this panel, we want to explore Latour's final and perhaps most powerful and most polemical works, which were almost exclusively preoccupied with the new climactic regime, a term he preferred to the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene. Now, in books like Critical Zones, Down to Earth, on the emergence of an ecological class after lockdown, Latour sets out a far-reaching account of how the interactions between relentless extractive capitalism, globalisation and deregulation, climate denial, and the growth of profound and extensive inequalities have effectively abolished a common world, have effectively cut the ground from humans by exposing the planet's increasingly loud and rapid reactions to gross exploitation of Indigenous and disempowered communities and the destruction of resources and habitats. For Latour, we moderns have been like absentee landlords, happily living on the earth, but ignoring what it means to live from and with it. He goes on to make the case in different ways and formats, and let's not ignore the fact that Latour worked across a huge range of formats: books, museum exhibitions, performances, art shows. And he argued in all of these that the climate in some way has been at the heart of all politics over the last 50 years. In his obituary in the London Review of Books, Jeremy Harding said, "Latour's last works were magnificent and elusive in turn, as he tried to get his bearings in the fog of climate change." And that's something we all share with Latour, the struggle to get our bearings in the fog of climate change. The sessions in our conference tomorrow on energy and transition, on Earth and off-Earth politics, and on care will explore these struggles and the political and social innovations they are provoking. Here today, we want to think with and about Latour and consider the significance and key conceptual registers of his thinking. What direction do they give us in developing a program of geosocial struggle committed to defending a planetary habitat for all terrestrial colonies that rely on it? And this is really the fundamental question driving this panel. And to commence, let's let Latour speak for himself. Let's look at a short clip from a video introduction he gave to his massive European research-funded project and inquiry into modes of existence, subtitled An Anthropology of the Moderns. And in this clip from around 2010, he's setting out the framing parameters of this huge project. And you'll see in the short excerpt that we're going to show you that he makes some crucial references to some of his key and most powerful ideas. Note his argument for multi-realism against Western rationality. While Westerns or moderns have knowledge, everyone else just has beliefs. His suggestion that diplomacy is central to entering into connections with other beings. And he's really posing the question, how do you do ecological analysis that's predicated on a recognition of cosmopolitics? And finally, his very powerful claim that we need to start again, that we have never been in the state that we currently face, and therefore exhausted categories like nature, economy, culture, facts, science need to be profoundly rethought. So let's have a look at him ranging across that territory.
And we begin to open, on the contrary, multiple paths for these modes of existence, which in a way allows for a comparison with the other collective, what are called cultures, but culture is not a very good word, which have developed all sorts of other ways of entering into connection with these different types of beings. So that's what the task is. It's to introduce multi-realism in the definition of Western rationality. Western rationality has never been about following only one thread, but about following many different threads, which each of them has its own felicity condition, and judge all the others according to its own shibboleth, if you want, or touchstone. But of course, when you try a mode of existence with another touchstone, it doesn't work. So you have to respect all of these different ways of entering in connection with other beings so that you can produce an anthropology. Now, where the things are more complicated, and this is why it becomes a collaborative enterprise, is the diplomatic aspect of this inquiry. There's absolutely no way that someone like me in my home or my office, even though I've done many different types of fieldwork, can succeed in not only following the thread of experience. Sometimes I believe that I'm able to do that. I mean, but the way to describe it, it works. But the disconnect between the thread of experience and the account, that I cannot do. It's impossible. There's no way I can do it by myself, because the version, the alternative version I propose for these different ways of entering into connection with other beings is of course my own. I mean, it's very idiosyncratic, it's very limited. And thus I need to organize a collective inquiry, which has three different aims. First, to try to see if we retrieve the experience, which is at the heart of the modernist history, even though it was never accounted this way. Second, to judge or propose or explore an alternative account for this experience. And third, which is of course the most difficult part, to begin to agree on what the notion of universal values had shortcut or accelerated much too fast, which is why it's called often Western ethnocentrism. We are still interested in universality. We are still interested in entering into connection with the other collectives in culture. It's still a rational enterprise, but it was done much too fast when we use only double-click as a way of expanding everywhere, politics, religion, science, economics especially, to the whole world. We need to start again, and the reason why we need to start again collectively is of course because of the ecological crisis, which means that we are now confronted with issues and re-understanding what used to be called nature, what used to be called economy, what used to be called culture in a completely different way, for which no culture, no collective, no society, no civilization ever was prepared. I mean, this is why no one has ever lived in the Anthropocene so far. And we need the collective effort and the collective undertaking of all the different collectives. But for that we need an anthropological comparison. We need to re-understand what the modern have been. We need to rethink at the time where we are not so much in power what we have been doing.
Well, always wonderful to see Latour live, straight to camera with his blunt philosophising, the creative intellectual drawing us into his thinking with such intensity. You can really feel his argument there. He's not worried about hard sociological content, about careful elaboration. He's making an appeal, setting out an intellectual agenda and explaining why it matters and what's at stake. And in this process, you can see he roams across a huge range of topics and implicitly expands the scope of politics. He also provokes us to think differently, to get out of our comfort zones of reductionism, critique, anthropocentrism, and start again. How then to assess this intellectual appeal and its legacy? And this brings us to our speakers. We're going to listen to all three speakers first before moving on to a panel discussion and then some questions if we have time. And our first speaker, Dipesh, Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty, is coming to us in a pre-recorded video. He's coming to us carbon neutral, basically. And he's the Kimpton Distinguished Service Professor of History, South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. He's the author of numerous highly influential books, including Provincialising Europe, Post-Colonial Thought and Historical Difference, The Calling of History, Sajudana Sarkar and His Empire of Truth, and in 2021, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. He's a founding member of Subaltern Studies, a consulting editor of Critical Inquiry, and a founding editor of Postcolonial Studies. In 2014, he was awarded the Toonby Foundation Prize for his contributions to global history, and in 2019, the Tagore Memorial Prize from the Government of West Bengal. Now, in the opening essay of Critical Zones, Latour interviews Dipesh. And the interview's titled When the Global Meets the Planetary. And Latour begins this interview by noting that Dipesh has been one of the first to convince historians meaning historians of human adventures, to pay attention to the introduction of coal and gas into the rhythms of social and world history. And it's this material and elemental shift that starts the trajectory where the global begins to make serious trouble for the planetary. Now, in order to get these recordings done, Dipesh and I had a conversation and I posed 3 questions to him. So the first question that I posed to him was, I asked him to reflect on the radical reorientations that Latour has generated in thinking and to assess their significance. So we'll just look at Dipesh's answer to that first question.
That's a very good question, and in beginning to answer it, one has to remember that Latour was somebody whose thoughts evolved over time. So there is no one particular thought that you can identify with Latour or identify him with. But there are also some constants. So while his thoughts were changing, there were also some constants in it. Starting out his research career as historian of science, looking at how labs work and how scientists work, how scientific truths are products of processes that take place within a lab. Going on from there to eventually to talk about what he saw as the falseness of the separation of nature from society. And the facts that he saw all around him of entanglement of the human being with the non-human, both living and non-living. He eventually became almost a philosopher of the human condition in what he called the new climatic regime. So if you go back to his classic, we have never been modern, where he questioned the separation of nature from culture or nature from society, on to his book on the politics of nature, where he was trying to imagine politics involving, let's say, trees or stones or rocks or rivers. And eventually his massive book called Modes of Existence, which I think, if my memory serves me right, Stephen Mukey translated into English. In all these books, Latour's attempt, lifelong, was to move away from humanocentric thoughts, move away from a view of activity or history in which we looked on humans exclusively as the agents of change. He wanted to, in his own words, he wanted to recompose what we had in common with other non-human things. So the phrase, a Latourian phrase would be to recompose the commons. In other words, to reconstitute the world on the basis of our knowledge of this entanglement. But, and this is a gift to all of us. We think with that, but for me, the gift is also problematic. And the problem comes from a kind of what I see as a lingering attachment to the idea of the political. In other words, my question is this, or the way I might formulate the problem is this, that when I say political, I mean the sense in which we use the word political tradition, political thought in modern universities. In the University of Chicago, for instance, where political refers broadly to a Western tradition of thinking politics. And that tradition from 17th century on has been humanocentric. There's no question. And it's been about securitizing human life, human property, human societies, peace and war between humans, all of those things. Now, when you expand that to bring within politics, and this is an experiment that some people have already tried with with success in some questions. When you expand that conception of rights representations to, let's say, a river, tree, or a rock or a hill, right? That they have a right to exist. We don't have a right to destroy them. It works up to a degree. I'm not denying that it works, and I think I welcome those measures. But the majority forms of life in the world are microbial. Viruses, bacteria. It's very hard to work out how to extend ideas of rights and representations to bacteria and viruses. But the bacteria and viruses are the basic foundation of life on this planet. Without them, we wouldn't exist. Even though sometimes, some of them become hostile, but our bodies are full of bacteria and viruses. And some of them have very friendly roles to play. I mean, some of them even exude the chemicals that make you feel the feelings you have as a human being. So our environment is within us, it's outside us, and Latour would have been one of the first people to say, you don't think of environment as outside of an organism, it's both inside and outside. But if you think that way, and if you think that this would be your way forward towards recomposing the commons, why would you still have a lingering attachment to the word political or politics? So I'm often, because this attachment seems to me to be inexcisable. It's there, and Latour had tremendous political passions. So he was, on one level, he was trying to rethink the political with the help of this theory of entanglements and connection between human and non-human, but it seems to me that it seems to me to be very difficult to see how our entanglement with viruses and bacteria, all of it, would constitute a ground for a common politics. I mean, just think of the pandemic. We treated this particular virus as an enemy. And the fact is, every time we treat a bacteria or virus as an enemy, with good reasons, our treatment becomes an evolutionary pathway for that bacteria or that virus, right? So it was because the virus was mutating that we were producing new kind of brands of vaccines, right? So now was the virus part of the political? The political was about whether people had access to vaccinations. The political was about whether, the rich countries were hoarding the vaccines, right? But those are all what humans understand by politics. So for me, Latour's attachment to politics was something I respected, valued, and shared. But I think how to clarify the connection between the recomposed commons and the political, how to do that for me remains an incomplete.
A lovely and powerful answer, raising some challenges to Latour's notion of politics. And a great account of COVID as well. And Dipesh has written some wonderful stuff in Critical Inquiry on COVID. The second question I posed to him was, Latour has been the key vanguard thinker to acknowledge the climate as a major political actor. And I'm posing this question to Dipesh as a leading historian. What is the significance of his claim that the new climactic regime has displaced humans as the agents of history? And this is how he approached that.
Well, I think, first of all, I completely agree with the premise of the question, that Latour indeed was a key thinker, helping us to think through the climate problem, the ongoing sort of climate problem. I think it's right to say that while we think of climate change as anthropogenic, that is caused by human institutions and human activities, but it's also showed to us that we are now entangled with clouds and tsunamis, and we can cause earthquakes, and those are also big events, and in themselves they're like causes that are sometimes beyond our control. So we used to imagine this world, the rivers and the mountains, as changing so slowly as to constitute a kind of mute background for the drama of human prosperity, human conflicts. And now it seems like, even when I think of the war in Ukraine, I mean, every time you throw a missile, you're adding more greenhouse gases. So you're causing more long-term problems. Every time a city gets hot and you turn up your air conditioner, you're causing long-term problems. But there's clearly something in which we can't think of humans only acting by themselves, because what used to be thought of as the mute background is now in the foreground. If you think of the Himalayas, for instance, the mountain range, shared by India and China and Pakistan, it has become the most militarized mountain range in the world because of geopolitics. But the geology of the mountain is now visible because it's a young mountain still growing. And if you keep blasting it with dynamites to create airstrips and roads and stuff, you cause landslides. The glaciers are receding, there are landslides being caused by human activities. So the mountain, the youth of the mountain and its own kind of dynamics have become part of what you have to take into account next time you go to build an airstrip there, right? So I completely agree that humans are not the sole actors anymore, and Latour is right on that. Latour has had a wonderful sentence in his book, Facing Gaia, the Gifford lectures he gave at the University of Edinburgh, where it's a sentence because, it's an interesting sentence because he changes his mind halfway through the sentence. So, as you know, geologists are now talking about our being in a new age, the Anthropocene, where humans are changing the history of the planet. Whereas we used to be in the Holocene, the warm, stable period when you could actually take the mountains and the rivers for granted, the period that has ended. And he has a sentence where he says, humans of the Holocene, that is, humans who still believe they're in the Holocene period of stability, are actually carrying out a war. And then he says, but with what? Not nature. It's a war against what he calls the earth-bounded humans and other creatures who seem earthbound and who want to remain earthbound in the Anthropocene. So creatures and humans who want to be a part of this planet and keep its life processes going. It is as if other humans who still think that they can go on, building more buildings, building more roads, fighting the wars of the 20th century for imperial gains. It is as though there's a war between those kind of humans who still assume a stable world, even though they know it's not stable, and humans and other creatures who recognize the instability of the world. Diplomacy will have to be what would be the form of this diplomacy? And I think you can't expect viruses and bacteria and trees to practice diplomacy. The diplomacy question is something that only humans will have to act on. And I think of it, the way I imagine this diplomacy is like a one-sided diplomacy. Normally in a war, both sides meet for diplomacy. And one-sided diplomacy, I think, would be performed by humans if they were to scale back their operations. So some form of withdrawal from the expansion of the human realm that we have relentlessly pursued for, let's say, the last 70 years, since the end of the Second World War. So that's how I would answer that question, that Latour has left us with a thought of war and the idea of diplomacy, and what I'm adding to is that the diplomacy has to be one-sided, because other creatures will be responding to the climate crisis, but they would not. It goes back again to this question, what is the political? And I think humans would have to think about it, and we would have to realize that, the expansion that we are in the middle of. And just to give you an example of what kind of expansion. So Bill Gates has just published a book called How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. But what he wants to see happen while avoiding the disaster is building housing for all human beings. For that to happen, let's say, in the next few decades, and he says this means building a New York City every year for the next 40 years. Now that's huge expansion. And if you follow Latour's idea of diplomacy, which I also associated with the Harvard evolutionary biologist Edward Wilson's idea of withdrawal. He has a book called Half Earth, where he says we should leave half of the surface of the planet for other forms of life. Then what Latour is recommending by diplomacy, as I interpret him, is pursuing forms of withdrawal from the expansionism of which we are very much still a part.
Pursuing forms of withdrawal, that's certainly something we'll be talking about tomorrow. The final question that I put to Dipesh was, if humans and all beings are now at the mercy of the planet, which is really what he was describing in his previous answer, what political tools and methods does Latour offer us? How do we engender different practices? What is a planetary political ecology? And you'll see in his answer, it's quite an extensive answer, but he also gives you a really beautiful account of the great acceleration, and we'll cut to that now.
Well, let me answer that question in terms of both what Latour offers us and some of the very friendly disagreements I always had with Latour. And I must say he was generous and large enough a human being to value disagreements and to make room for them. So I'm very much making my remarks in those spirit. So let me begin by saying how my own view of the crisis has certain elements that I share with Latour and certain elements that I probably don't share with him, on which we probably would have disagreed. So let me talk about first what I share with him. He and others, including my two colleagues on this panel, have made us realize that human beings don't exist by themselves. Even the oxygen we breathe as a fundamental requirement of our life is produced by the work of forms of life that we consider inferior. Bacteria, phytoplanktons in the seas, trees, and they've been doing it for hundreds of millions of years, long before we came along. So we were not even the end product in view of this arrangement of which we are the beneficiaries. And I think in coming to that realization, I've been helped by Latour, I've been helped by Isabel Stengers, Donna Haraway, but also by Earth system scientists, climate scientists, who very much think of the planet in these terms, that this is a planet on which biological processes and geological processes come together and have come together for very long periods of life, for billions of years, to support life, and for at least 500 million years to support complex, multicellular forms of life like ourselves. That said, we also have to remember that human experience of the world is such that in the same way that we don't see electromagnetic waves around us, we don't perceive ultraviolet rays, we also do not see bacteria or viruses. Without the scientific revolution of the 17th century, we wouldn't have known about bacteria and viruses. So all this knowledge is part of our intellectual cognition, not always part of our perception. Our perceptual mechanism that we have, the sense organs, they don't always let us feel the presence of these things. So when I fall in love or crave chocolate, I don't think my the bacteria and the viruses inside are craving chocolate. I think I'm craving chocolate. Or when I fall in love or enjoy a beautiful sunset, I think I am enjoying. So this sense of I persists in spite of the knowledge, right? And that's why we have jealousy. We have all the human emotions. We have all the human drama, which are scripted, not taking these co-actors into account. And if you think of human history purely in terms of human experience, then the facts are, as Steve Pinker has often said, the Harvard psychologist, that over the last 70 years or so, human beings have lived so well as they never have in the past. See, if you look at human population, human Homo sapiens, like our kind of animals, we are supposed to have been around for 300,000 years. It took us almost 300,000 years to get to the number 1 billion. So in 1900, we were 1.6 billion. At the end of the 20th century, in 2000, we were 1.6 billion. We came straight to 6. Today, we are 8, going on to 9 or 10. So there's been a huge expansion of population because through public health measures, through the invention of antibiotics, through our capacity to produce more food. I mean, you have to remember that even most Europeans didn't get 2 square meals a day in the 18th century. There's a lot of hunger in the world in the 19th and 20th centuries. Indian experience of British rule was an experience of famines. The Chinese were a famished country until they became an independent nation in 1949. All that memory of hunger with which I grew up, because I was born after Indian independence, but my parents were full of that memory. And if you look at the world today, if all that memories have receded in most places in the world, in most places, not all, but also, if you think of human life expectancy, in the 18th century was about 30 years average. We have more than doubled it. Even poor people have longer lives. If you think of human consumption, we have, if you ask the question, when did a lot of human beings begin to consume, like things like consumer durables, refrigerators, cars, and things like that, air conditioners. So it was in 1986 that we had 1 billion human consumers. Today we have more than 4 billion human consumers out of 8 billion humans. And every second billion was added faster than the preceding billion. So maybe 3 billion human beings live really badly, even today, but they live longer. And one of the interesting facts about all that is also that compared to the year 2000, when the majority of the consumers were, in the advanced, rich, developed countries, the majority of world's consumers today come from China, India, emerging nations in Africa, Latin American middle classes. So the middle class is more mixed, it's multicolored, it's multicultural. And so if you didn't think of climate change, if you didn't think of the environmental degradation, then you would see that we have provided more cattle for people so that we can eat them. We have more milk. We have increased the number of birds. The most populous bird now is the broiler chicken on the planet, far outstripping the next most naturally populous bird. We've now industrialized the life of fish. Fish used to be a wild catch, but now there's large amount of fish farming going on. Asia supplies 90% of the world's fish, the bulk of it coming from China. But all this industrialization of our lives and other forms of lives has a price. The price is climate change. The price is environmental degradation. But you see, so today, the politics of climate change faces the rising aspirations of populous nations like India and China for their people to live well. The Prime Minister Modi in India just declared a few days ago an aspiration, which may or may not be realized, that by 2047, India will be a developed country with no caste problems, no Hindu-Muslim conflicts, no poverty, he said. So here is the conundrum. The conundrum is that all these new nations of the world, the erstwhile poor nations, who still have a lot of poor people, learned throughout the 20th century to become global. You have to remember that when they became independent, their first problem was feeding their people. So my one disagreement with Latour I had was that Latour did not, in my opinion, fully understand the ethics, the human ethics and the humanist ethics that underlie the drive towards modernization in formerly poor countries. So a lot of, the leader of the untouchables, so-called untouchables in India, Ambedkar, used to say that I want the Enlightenment, I want modern factories for my country. So did Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, a lot of anti-colonial thinkers used to value it. And I always thought that Latour did not quite understand or appreciate this drive towards modernization. He always saw that as simply certain people copying the West, a blind copying of the West. But it's not a blind copying of the West. It has an ethical aspect to it, which is why I feel that it does not lie in the mouths of the people who are already privileged to say to the poor that you don't deserve my privileges. But on the other hand, we all know that sharing these privileges will only devastate the environment more. So we need a new kind of politics. And we need a politics that is informed by what Latour has taught us. But where again, but I also at the same time, unlike Latour, I think politics is a provincially human action. In other words, faced with climate change, every creature will try to adjust. They'll move, they'll find other places. From bacteria, viruses to trees, everything will move. Butterflies, insects, they will die off or move. But only humans will consciously ask, what is it that we can do? I mean, that is a question for humans alone. And that's why I come back to the question I started with, that politics, I think, is a parochially and provincially human concern and occupation. I know that some of my colleagues would argue that we need to go back to indigenous management of life and property. I think there's a lot to be learned from indigenous peoples, but we now need to manage all this for 8 billion people. And you have to remember that you don't want to advocate a measure, the brunt of which will be borne by the poor of the world. And therefore, I think we have to combine pro-poor thinking with what Latour has taught us. And I think that is an unfinished task, negotiating the conundrum we now face between 20th century, the kind of aspirations that were born of the 20th century, and kind of the sort of problems we have come to recognize in the 21st century as the price of those aspirations. But how we negotiate all that is an open question.
Well, a remarkable overview from Dipesh of both Latour's work, including his groundbreaking book on laboratory life with Steve Ulgar and its contribution to science studies, but he manages to have an extraordinary conversation with Latour and to query many of his ideas and arguments. And we're going to pick up those amendments that Dipesh suggests in the Q&A.